We are in a state of emergency. Today on Home, a close-up view of coronavirus and racism, twin ills that are ravaging the Black community here in the United States. At this very moment, both conditions are causing unimaginable pain and suffering. In the case of racism, Black people across America are saying enough is enough and we want justice because of this man, George Floyd. His death at the hands of a white police officer as onlookers pleaded for his life has outraged many. But will there be justice? We'll be joined by two lawyers who look to history and similar events of injustice around the world for the answers. Plus, how important are white allies to Black people's fight for social justice? A frank conversation between two outspoken global journalists is just ahead. And more chaos on the horizon as US President Donald Trump announces his country's intention to withdraw from the WHO. We'll be asking a public health expert what this means for Africa's fight against COVID-19 and disease outbreaks in the future. All this plus your comments and questions. It's a jam-packed show. Let's get started. Hello everyone, happy Monday. One of those days, a lot going on. Let's get to it, shall we? These are unprecedented times, and we've been saying as much for the last couple of months. We've been talking about the way coronavirus has essentially upended life all around the world. And in the last couple of days, right here in the United States, we've seen scenes play out on the streets of this country that were unimaginable just a few months ago. Riots, looting,
and just widespread anger after the killing of George Floyd. On the face of it, this is all about racism, but it's actually also intertwined with coronavirus, which is the focus of this show, Home with Isha Sesay. So we're doing things a little differently for the next few days. We are going to keep an eye not just on the continent, but also widen the lens to take in what's happening right here in the United States, and how the issues of coronavirus and racism are all coming together to fuel the protests that we're seeing here in this country. As always, we start things off with a look at the numbers on the continent of where the pandemic is in Africa. We take in the full view. Let's bring you the total number of cases right now in Africa. And right now, as we take a look at it, confirmed cases of coronavirus, 149,000 rather, 686. Of those, 82,412 are active. Let's look at the confirmed death numbers there. As you see there, 4,267. Let's drill down and take a regional view. In Northern Africa, Egypt is still leading the way. They're out in front in the region, 24,985. And in terms of deaths, 959. Algeria, the second most impacted nation in the region. Those numbers continue to creep up. 9,513 deaths, 661. Let's turn, our attention to, to Cameroon, which remains the most impacted country in Central Africa. The numbers there have gone past the 6,000 mark. Currently, there are 6,143 confirmed cases and deaths, 197. I want to highlight for you Burkina Faso, where militant violence and instability continues to swell the numbers of the displaced, all of this creating the perfect conditions for the spread of coronavirus in that country. Currently, 847 cases, 53 deaths, but we are watching things there very closely. Let's turn to the east now, and Sudan remains a place of concern. The numbers there, 5,026 confirmed cases, 286 deaths. Rwanda had been moving towards reopening on June 1st, but then they reported a death in that country due to coronavirus. Rwanda currently has 370 cases. Let's turn our attention to West Africa, my home region, where the reopening goes on. Nigeria, Africa's most populous nation, has gone past the 10,000 mark. They are one of just a handful of countries to do so. They reached the milestone on the last day of May. Current numbers in Nigeria, 10,162. Total deaths, 287. Ghana, the president spoke there last night, Sunday, about reopening. They have more than 8,000 cases there. Total confirmed deaths, 36. And Sierra Leone, of course, my home country, where right now the country has 865 cases in Sierra Leone, confirmed deaths 46. On this first day of June, the president announced that wearing masks would now be mandatory. Let's finish things up on the southern side, the southern half of the continent. South Africa continues to lead the way in terms of cases there. Looking at those numbers, as you see there, 34,000 now, 357, deaths 705. The resumption of the sale of alcohol in South Africa was met with singing and long queues. They're selling alcohol now in South Africa. It had been banned. The numbers continue to go up. 34,357, and finishing up on the continent with Zambia's numbers, which are still creeping up. 1,089 deaths registered, 7. A quick look at the coronavirus numbers on the continent for you. Let's move on. So last Friday, as the world and people here, right here in the United States, like myself, watch escalating racial tensions in the US, and coronavirus numbers right here escalated. This country currently has about 1.7 million cases, and over 100,000 people have lost their lives. The president of the United States, Donald Trump, took an opportunity to address the nation, but he didn't talk about coronavirus or racism. No. On Friday, as we all watched, waiting for the president to speak out about what has been hogging headlines here in the United States, the president announced that the US would be withdrawing from the World Health Organization. It was an unprecedented move to use a moment of national crisis to address something else. Take a listen to what he had to say.
China has total control over the World Health Organization. despite only paying $40 million per year compared to what the United States has been paying, which is approximately $450 million a year. We have detailed the reforms that it must make and engage with them directly, but they have refused to act. Because they have failed to make the requested and greatly needed reforms, we will be today terminating our relationship with the World Health Organization and redirecting those funds to other worldwide and deserving urgent global public health needs.
Well, 450 million is a significant loss to the World Health Organization, but what does it mean for this battle against coronavirus? What does it specifically mean for Africa? Let's bring in Vivian Ojo. She joins me now from Lagos to discuss this further. She's a public health expert and she's also a consultant with McKinsey and Company. Vivian, welcome. Nice to see you again.
Good to see you as well. Thanks so much for having me a second time.
No, your expertise is invaluable, particularly at a moment like this. We talked about this some weeks ago when the threat was first raised. The US president has now gone forward and announced the intention to withdraw from the WHO at this particular moment in time. What does it mean? What does it mean for the fight against coronavirus? What does it mean specifically for Africa?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the World Health Organization has actually been bracing itself for, the unpredictability of the current sort of global politics that we're seeing. One of the interesting moves that has been made by Dr. Tedros is actually the formation of the World Health Organization Foundation, which they announced quite recently as a way to get more non-traditional forms of funding. To be fair, this process has been in place for about 2 years, and they have sort of been coming around to forming this foundation. But something like what we're seeing with COVID and what we're seeing with the United States and the criticism that has come in has actually fueled and sped up some of those processes. So in a way, that there is indeed that silver lining. That the organization realizes that it cannot depend as significantly on some of these political allies.
While the organization was making moves to, I guess, counteract, the US going through with the threat, which it has now done. What does it mean for the WHO's broader efforts? Because obviously the WHO isn't just battling coronavirus. It is the organization that coordinates all fronts against infectious disease outbreaks. And, a place like DRC is battling Ebola. These things happen at the same time, how does it move forward now? I mean, how much is it hobbled by the lack of coordination with US entities?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a critical point that you mentioned because COVID-19 is sort of the topical issue at the moment. I think that's very easy for us to forget that, particularly in the African continent, you actually have a significant number of people dying from diseases like malaria and tuberculosis and HIV, and indeed Ebola, as you've mentioned. So I think that the World Health Organization is, as I mentioned, is very much stretched by what seems to be an additional strain of COVID, and then also managing a lot of the political relationships. I also think that one thing to recognize is that the WHO, as we see it today, is really a product of almost 200 years of global health diplomacy. And so indeed, even to get to this point where you have the trust of the countries that it does have, has been a pretty slow process. And so to see some of that being undone is extremely scary, I would say, for a lot of people who are interested in global cooperation and are deeply concerned about this health crisis.
And to that point, how much is this damage global cooperation amongst the remaining parties at the WHO? I mean, there are some who fear that what we're going to see is actually a strengthening of China's position in the WHO. Is that a fear that you have?
So I actually think what's going to happen is you're going to see the WHO is going to need to learn to be a little bit more innovative about where they get their funding from. And indeed, these non-traditional sources are already coming through. And they're going to need to be creative about the relationships that they manage. But inevitably, I don't see the WHO ever really becoming a political party. The minute it becomes a political party, it really loses the edge that it has. So one of the things that Donald Trump mentions is, he's going to diversify funds and, send them elsewhere. So you can imagine there are global funds, there are, other organizations that are doing meaningful healthcare work, like the Global Fund, that can do with this funding. But in terms of organizations that have the real trust and the authority of the World Health Organization, there really aren't a lot of substitutes for that. And I think that what the WHO is going to have to learn to do now is just learn how to play the politics even better, and sort of dissociate itself from being any one ally.
Vivian Ojo, it's always good to get your perspective. It's so important. Thank you very, very much for joining us on this Monday. Stay safe.
Thank you for having me, and looking forward to hearing more about Black Lives Matter and all the awesome work you're doing to cover our struggle.
Thank you very much. We'll be doing it all week, so I hope you can tune in.
Great.
All right, well, we should watch to see what happens with regards to US efforts to withdraw from the WHO. It must be said there are those that say the president actually can't go through with that move. Excuse me, that there's some congressional oversight on congressional involvement. We shall see, but let's move on and turn the spotlight on events happening here in the United States. All around the world, and as I said right at the top, here in the United States, we have watched over the last few days as protests erupted in city after city. People have taken to the streets to protest the killing of an unarmed Black man by a white police officer, George Floyd. We have seen the pictures now over and over again as former police officer Derek Chauvin raised his knee on the neck of George Floyd for almost 9 minutes, and we watched in horror as the man lost his life, and as people begged for him to be released, if you will. They begged for mercy, which never came, and we watched George Floyd die there on camera. Chauvin now has been charged. He's been charged with third degree murder, manslaughter. We're going to get into the issues of the case, the legal aspects in just a few moments. But I want to take you to Minneapolis first, where this all started, because one of our team, one of our very own, Taka Zen, is there. She's our home correspondent. She also is a freelance journalist with the Washington Post, and she is on the scene where George Floyd lost his life. And she joins us now. Taka, thank you for joining us. I know that George Floyd's brother led a prayer for him just a few moments ago. Can you talk to us about what's happening where you are? Just a short time ago.
Yeah, so right now, the place where Floyd died is now a healing space. As you can hear over there, there's an indigenous Native American group that's drumming and dancing. Every few steps that I take, someone asks me, do you need food? Do you need water? Do you need a mask? The community has really came out and transformed this space. Right behind me, I'm at a mural that's been painted in honor of George Floyd. The floor is completely lined with flowers and candles. So many people have come out. I would say maybe about 1,000 people are out right now, probably even more than that. They're laying flowers down right in front. People are just here gathering in a space of healing for them.
It's amazing to see these scenes and how the community is really coming together. Talk to me about community leaders and activists, what they're saying now after the scenes from the weekend.
Well, community leaders have definitely taken action in a way that has been gathering folks to rally around food and rally around giving folks groceries since a lot of shops have closed. One community leader, right after Derek Chauvin was charged, came out to this space and he talked a little bit about how, yes, we have one, but there's still 4 more to go. El Amin, Imam El Amin, let's take a listen.
Not going to stand for this, and don't allow them to take the narrative away from us. This is about human life and the devaluing of human life and systemic injustice. That's what this is about. So I'm asking y'all to stand with me on this day of prayer, and I'm praying for the God. I'm asking God to give us the strength, give us the fortitude, give us the courage to take this thing all the way to the end.
So leaders are echoing the same sentiments. They want to see all 4 officers involved convicted.
And I've got to ask you, Taka, going back to the scenes from the weekend and the destruction that we've seen and the looting, we are hearing more and more about outsiders coming in and infiltrating these groups and being responsible for the vandalism, for that looting, at least some of it. Have you got any more details on that? Have any more details been shared by the authorities?
Yes, absolutely. There have been white supremacist groups confirmed that have been out in these protests, anarchist groups that have been setting fires. In North Minneapolis, where farther away from South Minneapolis where things went down, there were buildings that just started burning. No one really knew why or how it happened. They just suddenly came on fire and community members had no clue what happened. Yesterday, actually, on the bridge of I-35W, there was a peaceful protest that was marching down the highway, and a semi-truck completely went through the group. Everyone fortunately separated and was able to be safe, but could have been incredibly a travesty here in Minneapolis. Luckily, everyone's safe, but it's those types of events that we're seeing that's happening. That's not from the community. It's not from protesters. It's not for people that are asking for justice.
And Taka, before I let you go, I've got to ask you on a personal note. You know, you're there in Minneapolis. This is a place that you live, that you know have been forming a life. It's your community. Talk to me about just how you're feeling at a time like this.
It's hard. I don't feel like I've had time to completely process because I've been on the go, I've been working, but it is devastating to feel the pain that my community is feeling, to see everything that's happened and how it's been completely transformed, almost to resemble a war zone. Yeah, it's very hard, but I'm trying my best to keep working and bring the community accurate news that they need during this time. So,
yeah. And one last question for you. Minneapolis has long prided itself as a progressive place. Beautiful lakes, beautiful buildings, a progressive mayor. But when you kind of dig into it, you know, the data points to huge inequities between, whites and non-whites. Can you just speak to that? And I guess, really, on a personal note, is it something that you were acutely aware of before this moment and the streets were set on fire?
Absolutely. The disparities here in Minneapolis, in the entire state of Minnesota, actually, for Black and brown folks in this country or in this state is incredibly horrifying. It's some of the worst achievement gaps for Black and brown students. It's the worst economic home ownership for Black people here. We have, I could go on and on and on, but the disparities exist and the police force operates within that system. So people are feeling it from every which way. The police brutality here was just the catapult that took it over.
Yeah. Taka Zen, we are grateful for you, a longtime member of the Home with Isha Sesay production team, also working with the Washington Post. Thank you so much, Taka. Please be safe.
Thank you. I'll stay safe, Mom.
Take care. All right. So you heard from Taka that, that she was right there on the scene where George Floyd lost his life just over a week ago, and people are working to turn that into a space of healing. And community leaders are out there, and food is being shared, and murals are being put up, and there are flowers everywhere. But this is a contrast to what we've seen in other parts of Minneapolis over the last few days, where we have seen crowds, hordes of people on the street clashing with police. We saw the 3rd Precinct on fire. We saw the Target being looted, widespread scenes of destruction. But Taka said that, they're getting more details about far-right groups, anarchist groups coming in and being part of that effort to cause destruction, to set buildings on fire. We're waiting for more details from the authorities on that, because we have heard even the governor of Minnesota speak to that, saying that of the arrests that have taken place, those people have been from out of town. So we'll look at that. But that's one side of things. The other side of it, and that we can't lose focus of, is what Taka said, that the disparities between white people and Black and brown people in the state are horrifying when it comes to education achievement, home ownership, when it comes to the way they're treated by the police. That is real. It's not imagined. The data is there to back that up. And people have been feeling this for a very, very long time in a place like Minnesota, specifically Minneapolis, that's in the spotlight right now, and in many places around the United States. And it has become this moment that people are galvanizing around to examine the system of the United States, to examine why time after time after time, unarmed Black men and women wind up dead because of the actions of white police officers, and why time after time after time there is no justice. That is a question that people want answered, and that is something that people want to see change. They want a different outcome in this instance, and in every other case involving the killing of unarmed Black men and women. We will wait to see what will happen to the other 3 police officers who were involved in George Floyd's killing. You heard the police chief over the weekend say he views them as complicit as the officer who the neck of George Floyd and held it there until that man died. We shall see if they will be charged, but people are demanding justice, and there is no clear sense of what it will take to dissipate the very, very heightened feelings and tensions in this country. You have been writing in. Let's go to some of those comments now and share them with you. I want to say thank you to everyone who is here with me on this Monday. We are always grateful. Let's look at it. The comments, obviously, some of them start with the conversation around the WHO and President Trump's announcement that the US will withdraw. Here we have from Marietta Patricia Taylor Kamara. Don't believe Mr. Trump, what he's saying. WHO and public health for Africa. I guess she's making the point that we'll keep going. We're looking at more comments around the George Floyd. Titi Bangro says, this is very sad. Rest in peace, George Floyd. Alaji Amara Kabe says, the most disturbing thing I've seen, systemic injustice. I am still sad. Mohammed B. Fofana says, a lot of white people have no respect for Blacks. King Aloma says, I believe there will be a lot of false flag operations to be launched by right-wing groups. Yeah, King Aloma, that is something that is really now becoming an increasing topic of conversation on this Monday. Who are these elements? Who's behind them? Who's paying them to come into these areas? And what they're destroying is the shops, the institutions that serve the Black community. And many questions to be answered about who these elements are. Sojourner says the death of Floyd shows that systemic racism and injustice will remain until the system is overhauled. Keep these comments coming in. We are going to have a slightly longer show today so that we can get your opinions out there and so that we can all be part of this conversation, because this is a deeply troubling moment here in the United States, being viewed not just by people who live here like myself, but all around the world. So let's take a look at the legal angle to this case now. You heard me say that that officer has been charged, third-degree murder, manslaughter. But why were those the charges that were brought? We also heard that Attorney General Keith Ellison has now been appointed to oversee the case. What does that mean for how things go forward? Let's dive into all of this and peel back the layers. Joining me now to talk about this, to talk about whether there will be justice and to look around the world for similar or comparable cases, we have two great attorneys with us for this conversation. Ariva Martin is a civil rights attorney right here in Los Angeles, and join me from Juba in South Sudan is Edmund Yakani. He's the founder and executive director of Community Empowerment for Progress organization, CEPO. He's a human rights and peace activist. Welcome to you both. Welcome, Ariva. Welcome, Edmund.
Good morning.
Thank you.
Let me start with you, Ariva, as you are right here where I am in the United States. Give us your thoughts on the charges that have been brought so far. Third-degree murder, manslaughter. In your view, are they appropriate?
No, not at all. I was outraged by the charges by the district attorney office. The third-degree murder charge is really a smack in the face. It feels like it was just something, the district attorney came up with to appease the family and the community. There's clear evidence from that videotape, as well as what we've learned from eyewitnesses, that there was intentionality and that there could have been a second-degree murder charge. There's a huge difference under Minnesota law. That third-degree manslaughter charge carries up to 25 years, whereas that second-degree murder charge carries a sentence up to 40 years. But when you look at the almost 9 minutes that Chauvin had his knee kneeling on Mr. Floyd's neck, and then there was an additional 3 minutes where Mr. Floyd wasn't moving, and then 2 more minutes where there was no pulse, and yet Chauvin continued to kneel on the neck of Mr. Floyd. All of that evidence suggests that he knew what he was doing, and he continued to do it despite the repeated pleas from Mr. Floyd that he couldn't breathe, that he thought he was going to die, even calling for his mother, who's deceased, as he himself must have known that he was about to die. So he's calling out for his mother in his last words before the breath is literally, strangled out of him by this knee.
It's just so horrific. Edmund, to you, and let me come to you with this news that is just breaking right now, that we're just learning that according to the independent autopsy, which was ordered by George Floyd's family, that independent determination is that George Floyd died from mechanical asphyxiation. Working to get more details on that, but this is what the independent autopsy is saying. Ariva, I'll come to you for your thoughts on that and how that may or may not alter the legal case. But Edmund, to you, when you looked at that video, given all that you've seen from your work around the world, when you looked at that video and then you saw the charges brought, and now you hear what the independent autopsy is saying, give me your thoughts.
I do agree with my sister in terms of her thoughts about the charges. I really personally, I don't accept those charges. As to the killing of George is intentional, and the police knew what he is doing, and he knows the consequences of what he is doing. So personally, I feel like there's a much work need to be done. Legally, I don't agree with the charges mentioned. So I do agree with my sister. It's a painful, it's a horrific, it's something that done intentionally. And also this tells you very clear across the globe how police leadership compromise with the issue of human rights, with the issue of justice, with the issue of accountability.
Speak to that a little bit more, and give me examples of where it has really stood out to you about this lack of accountability of police when you look around the globe.
Similar incidents happen across the region where I am in East Africa. Similar incidents have happened in Uganda, it's happened in South Sudan. We have renowned journalists in South Sudan murdered, and it's an intentional murder. But when you see the charges brought against the people who are involved in his murder, it's similar. So it seems like across the law enforcement agencies are taking a position of covering up crimes and trying to show themselves that whatever they're doing it with the purpose of making rule of law to prevail. But actually what they're doing is opposite. They are committing atrocities against human rights values, against the rule of law, and they try to compromise not to take responsibility for the incidents. It has happened in Africa, it's happened in the Middle East. We have seen what's going on now with the Al Jazeera journalists in Egypt. So all this is intentionally done by law enforcement agencies, and they try to clean themselves up from the crimes that they've committed.
Ariva, back to you. This determination, this conclusion of the independent autopsy of mechanical asphyxiation, what does that mean to you?
Well, it's not really surprising, given what we witnessed on the videotape. We knew that he was actually being, the life was being choked out of him because of this knee on his airway, this compression that was happening with respect to his airway. And there was also a report out earlier this morning that this police department, this Minneapolis police department, has had 44 individuals who have had a similar mechanism used on them that has caused them to lose consciousness. So this is not new for this police department. This is a violation of their own policies and the use of a chokehold type maneuver that they know causes people to become unconscious, and if used for prolonged periods, like in Mr. Floyd's case, can cause them to die. So the medical examiners report, the independent medical examiners report, not really telling us anything that we didn't know, confirming it in scientific ways. So that's important from a legal standpoint, but it's what we all witnessed.
And Ariva, you made mention of the police department and their checkered, that's putting it politely, their checkered past when it comes to policing, if you will, their officers. But let's talk about the officer himself, Chauvin. This is a guy who has countless past complaints against them. How much will those weigh on this case?
Well, they will be significant. He had, to be exact, 18 complaints against him for some form of misconduct, and only 2 of those resulted in actual reprimand. So here's a person who had a pattern of misconduct in his interaction with citizens, and those charges, raises real serious questions about him in terms of why he was even allowed to be on the streets of Minneapolis policing. But what's going on in a broader sense inside that police department? This is not the first incidents. You can go back to Jamar Clark, you can go to Philando Castile. There's a long list of African-American unarmed men who've been killed by Minneapolis Police Department. So when we look at the protests that have erupted, they're much bigger than Mr. Floyd. And yes, Mr. Floyd's death was horrific. We saw it played out on videotape, but this is anger, pent up frustration and anger over years of abusive practices by this police department and a justice system that does not value the lives of African-American people, that see us as criminals and suspects rather than as citizens.
So, I would ask you for your reaction to the national security, that situation. I don't know if you saw his comments over the weekend. He said there is no systemic racism within the U.S. police force.
Yeah, well, that national security director works for Donald Trump. And so, in some ways, that's enough said. And Donald Trump himself has a history of stoking racial division, making racially inflamed comments. The tweet that he made just a couple of days ago about the thugs who were protesting, referring to peaceful protesters, many of whom we should point out were white. And there's this, negative imagery, images that sometimes project African Americans as being out, engaged in some kind of, misconduct. But the majority of these protesters we've watched recently have been non-African American. They're not thugs. And then the other comment that when they loot, we shoot. So Donald Trump has no credibility. That national security advisor has no credibility. And unless he's been living under a rock for the last 400 years, that's just a completely ridiculous and inaccurate statement.
Edwin, to you, I mean, when you hear Ariva laid out there about the state of policing, of racial inequity, systemic injustice towards Black people or non-white here in this country, I wonder what you think of it, especially given the way America on the outside in Africa is long looked at as, you know, a champion of tolerance and a defender of human rights. I wonder what you make of this moment as the veil is stripped back.
It's a very disappointing incident. At the same time, it have reduced the value of the United States standing in the global community on protection of human rights. Because as a human rights defender, I start questioning the system in US. How much is the system being designed in a way that promotes the value that US is standing for? And for example, in my country, we are implementing a peace agreement where we have US military as UN peacekeeping force. It have given me a level of mistrust on the law enforcement agents of US, because as my sister is describing, if that's the nature of the police that have committed crime several times, is not being held accountable and is given duty to go to a street to commit these atrocities, now we shall have, as Africans, huge mistrust on UN law enforcement agencies and the UN peacekeeping force. In simple terms, I would say US have lost its reputation, and we have built a lot of mistrust towards US in terms of law enforcement agents with respect of human rights or upholding rule of law, because this is completely contrary to what we're hearing from Africa about statements coming from US policymakers, funding coming from USAID. It's completely contrary. Yeah. And I would like to tell you, honestly, in the streets of Juba, everybody's questioning it's a policy. And means in US still the concept of discrimination is being upheld by state agencies.
Yeah, I mean, the effects of this go so far beyond the borders of the United States. Ariva, everyone, as you know, around the world is looking at this moment and looking to see what happens next. We know that one police officer has been charged. What about the other three?
Yeah, the question is, why haven't they been charged? Yeah. I just want to punctuate my last point about that national security advisor. The systemic racism in police departments around the United States is well documented. So I hope he'll pick up a book and read. But as it relates to those other three officers, there's no reason that they shouldn't be charged. Police chiefs, including the chief of the Minneapolis Police Department, have all indicated that they should be arrested. And if they were regular citizens, and if we were witnessing regular citizens engaged in the kind of conduct that we saw from these police officers, they would be in custody as we speak. Even though Attorney General Ellison in the state of Minnesota has taken over the case, he himself has said, we're not going to rush to judgment. But those of us that are watching this, those of us in the legal community and the civil rights community, we don't understand what is taking so long. You don't have to prove your entire case to make an arrest. All you need is probable cause. And there is sufficient probable cause on that videotape for the arrest of everyone involved in Mr. Floyd's death.
Ariva, it's not just, we're talking about George Floyd's death, obviously, and that's in the spotlight, but I do want to flag to you something else. As I watched the protests unfold over the weekend, I also saw, separate to the violence that George Floyd suffered, police in many places across this United States unleashing violence on protesters. I mean, in startling ways, captured on camera. And I'm wondering whether we are likely to see those officers held accountable and prosecuted. I mean, because it seems so incredibly difficult to get a successful prosecution of a police officer in this country. So A, is it likely? And B, why is it so difficult to successfully prosecute police officers here in the United States?
Well, starting with your first question, we know that in Atlanta, 2 officers that pulled some students out of their car were terminated. Yes, the taser, they were terminated quickly. We don't know if charges have been filed against those officers. To answer your question, I don't have a lot of confidence that any of the officers involved in this misconduct that you just identified, that we've all witnessed, that those officers will be held accountable. There's this kind of sense now that because the quote unquote protesters are out of control, the police have the right to be out of control. So that's what you're hearing from some of the top elected officials, as it, justifying the conduct, this aggressive conduct on the part of the police. And that's really unfortunate. I would hope that they would be held accountable, but to be honest with you, I don't have a lot of confidence that they will be held accountable. And to your second point, it's so difficult to prosecute police in this country. There are a couple of reasons. One, there's that symbiotic relationship between police and district attorneys. And many district attorneys are reluctant to even charge and arrest police. So you can't get a conviction if you can't get an arrest and an indictment. So we've seen in case after case after case, it's not until there's a video that's been circulated on social media, there's not until there's widespread pressure that some district attorneys will even charge the police officers. And then in the case like Mr. Floyd, they charge with 3rd-degree murder instead of the 2nd-degree murder. Then you get to the point of actually having a public trial. And many times jurors are reluctant to hold police officers accountable. They give them the benefit of the doubt. They have a presumption in this in our criminal justice system that they're somehow above the law. And it has been incredibly difficult. We've seen cases where police officers have shot someone on videotape, and we saw this in a case out of Cincinnati, a college police shoots a man in his back on videotape, and there are 2 hung juries, and there was never a conviction of that officer. So when we talk about criminal justice reform in the United States, it starts from the arrest stage, it goes all the way to trial and conviction, and we've got to change the way police officers are viewed. And yes, those good police officers that are doing the good work protecting citizens, let's applaud them. But we have to change a system that promotes too many that engage in the kind of conduct we saw in that videotape with respect to Mr. Floyd.
Yeah, absolutely. Edmund, to you, the final question. We've seen that a number of individuals in various countries around the world, including in Africa, in Ghana, in Liberia, have taken to the streets to stand in solidarity with Black protesters here in the United States and to protest the killing of George Floyd. But they're also taking an opportunity to also reflect on issues domestically in their own domestic countries on the continent. Do you see what happened to George Floyd and this public protest, this public reaction, sparking similar heightened calls for accountability on the continent?
Yes, in the continent of Africa and in my own country, South Sudan, today we've been raising concerns among ourselves about the code of conduct of police, the training curriculum for policing services, and looking the nexus between policing services and looking at the justice system, and we're trying to ask ourselves, because the case of George, it is a similar case that has been happening in the continent. And the same way how the police behave, the same way how the justice system responds in US is the same way in our own countries. And we start questioning ourselves, can this be a trigger for us to question the curriculum of policing, for us to question commitment of policing to ethics of rule of law, and for us to start questioning, is really the justice system independent from policing services, or the justice system is more lean to favor policing services in our countries? So I think that raised that, as like my sister have said, is that we start really having mistrust on our own systems, that actually politicians and leadership of law enforcement agencies and justice sectors are favoring their actions against civil rights or against human rights and against rule of law. So in the content that have raised up a big issue, start questioning that this has happened in US, it's happening with the police institution. And unfortunately, in my country like South Sudan, we took it serious because most of our policing ethics are being borrowed from US. We believe that US shows democracy to the global community. We start asking if that is a democracy that we are aspiring to have in our country, is that the attitudes that all these experts and the UN peacekeeping mission and the experts coming through USAID money is coming to insert those values into our policing services, in the US, a member of the Troika, pushing so much for justice and accountability in South Sudan through hybrid courts. But we start asking, if US is demanding justice in South Sudan, why not justice at home? Because charity begins at home. So we have a feeling as a human rights defenders in South Sudan that actually charity at home is under attack in US before they could tell us justice in South Sudan. And that is where we lose huge respect and lack of trust on when US leaders start demanding justice while back home the house is rotten. So for me, it goes beyond. And I think the leadership in US need to feel that it's not only an issue of US, it becomes a global issue. It's not a question of George family. It's not a global demand for justice and accountability. US must demonstrate before tell others what is justice and what is accountability.
Well, I thank you for such important comments and important perspective. Areva Martin, Edmund Yakani, thank you for this conversation. I think it was much needed to draw the parallels between the United States and around the world, where there's an equal demand for justice and accountability of police. Thank you so much, Areva and Edmund. Please stay safe.
Good to see you. Take care.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Such important perspective there, as you heard from Areva. Her view and the view of many people in the United States is that that officer, the one of the four who has been charged, was undercharged, and if it had been anybody else, the other three who are still, out and about, they have been fired. It's true, but they haven't been charged. And the feeling amongst many in the legal profession and beyond is that if they were black, if they were regular civilians, they would have been charged already and taken into custody. But I think Edmund's perspective as a South Sudanese human rights lawyer was deeply important to share. That the United States goes around the world and it exports its idea of democracy and how things should be done. And it has many people in many places on the continent now questioning the legitimacy of their perceived right to tell other countries how to police their people, how to run their elections, how to handle their affairs. An important conversation there. Let's see what you think of everything. The comments have been coming in fast, I see. Looking at Marita Patricia Taylor Kamara, she says, yes, not showing a good example for the South Sudanese police force. Martha Sesay, referencing the independent autopsy, saying it's just come in. Let me see, Kamara Habib Tagore says, in the midst of COVID, police officers arresting black people is premeditated by police officers to kill healthy black people. King Alama saying about the investigation, no stone should be left unturned. And Margaret Cole, this is so blatant. How can we ensure that this never happens again? I mean, that's the question. How do you stop it from happening again? Because if history is any guide, sadly, it more than likely will happen again. The question is, will people be brought to justice? Jibril says the whole world should protest against Americans, whether they have an embassy, for them to know that the world, wherever they have an embassy, for them to know that the world is united against racism. Adama Maxil says the three other police officers should be charged as well because they stood there and did nothing. Again, I think there's this general consensus. Deje Dulbangura, they told us to love one another, but they're doing something else. My question is, who's next? Many thoughts being expressed, and it's hard to find dissenting voices. At the end of the day, how can anyone defend what we saw there? Vivian Ojo, the burden of trust in U.S. as justice and civil rights leader. Brilliant perspectives from Edmund and Areva. That was Vivian Ojo, who was just on the show. Thank you, Vivian. All right, let's move on, shall we? Excuse me, not quite sure what is going on with my throat today, but let's move on. All right, now the effects of slavery really in the oppression and the degradation of black people from that time to now is what continues to cast a shadow over this country. And there has long been a fight for that wrong to be righted and for Black people to be given their rightful place, an equal place, a respected place here in the United States. But it's not just here in the United States that we see the racism towards Black people and the discrimination of Black people. It has been seen around the world. We saw in South Africa an entire system based on discrimination and separation, and that targeted Black bodies. And we also saw a fight that led to the dismantling of that system. And we want to have a conversation now about how you get there, how you structure that fight, and also who is involved in the fight. What is the role for allies, for non-Black people in this fight, as we all call for greater justice? What is the role for our white friends and colleagues? And we wanted to have a conversation that brings in the perspectives from around the world. So we've got two renowned journalists with us now. Ridi Clubby joins us now from Johannesburg, and Rokhaya Diallo, who is joining us from Paris. Both incredibly insightful ladies, and we are so lucky to have them with us today. Ladies, welcome.
Hello, my friend.
Hello. Ridi, let me start with you and just get your perspective of the video, first and foremost, of George Floyd's killing, as a South African who has seen much of the violence that played out in your past. Tell me what went through your mind when you saw those images.
I mean, I thought, what is wrong with the United States? We know that racism, state power, oppressive state apparatuses like violent police services are an international global phenomenon. But there's something about a country that posits itself as the bulwark of democracy, that sells itself as the most progressive, the most reformed. There's something so crass and absolutely grotesque about its inability to negotiate with people that it arrests, its inability to put boundaries on its power, and to see that kind of depravity. You want to ask, what on earth is wrong with the United States? Now, all these things are historic, but there was something about that video and many others that tells you that there's a brazenness, that those who hold power in the United States don't give a damn who is watching. And that's often what happens when you use powerful, oppressive state apparatuses. And I think that's what the police in the United States have become.
Mm-hmm. Rokhaya, to you, I mean, we've seen aggressive policing in France and the targeting of Black people. It's well documented. Your thoughts on what we saw here in the United States with the killing of George Floyd?
Even if, thank you for giving me a slot. Even if we know about the police killings and the police brutality in the US, it is still shocking. And the first thing I thought when I saw, I didn't watch the entire video, but I saw some graphic images, and I thought about the lynching, the images of the lynching that were that circulated in the 20th century, and that were meant to terrorize Black people. And when I saw that video, I just saw the message that is sent to Black and brown people is that is what is happening to you. That is what happens to you if you dare to just be alive out of your home in the public sphere. And to me, the fact that the police officer felt so able, so entitled to do so, just looking at the camera, and for such a long time, meant that the message was not only sent to the poor George Floyd who died, but to all the Black and brown people, to say, your life doesn't count. Like, you can do whatever you do. We are able to just kill you in front of someone filming, and there is no consequence. So I really felt like it was meant to terrorize people who looked like George Floyd.
Ridi, you you're in South Africa, your South African protest is, I mean, you think South Africa, actually, you think protest in many ways. You know, we have seen the protests lit the streets during apartheid. What do you make of the protests we're seeing here in the United States, and the way they have now, in some places, as being reported, they're being infiltrated by outside elements, and we're seeing this violence? Many saying it detracts from the actual issue at hand. How do you read the protests?
I mean, these protests are absolutely heartbreaking, but at the same time, Aisha, it's about time. It's about time that the world sees the United States for what it is and what it represents. Land of the free, who's free? Land of the brave, yeah, the people who are brave are the ones who wake up every single day wondering, am I ever going to get back home? We know protest here in South Africa, and there's been a lot of solidarity between South Africa and the United States because we face the same kind of intractable race issues. So when we watch what is happening right now, what is heartbreaking about it is the man who occupies the White House, the fact that he's supposed to be a voice of reason to calm all his people. He's supposed to be the president for all his people, even those who didn't vote for him. But he's almost salivating at the thought of more violence. That's what's so scary. And that, Aisha, even the most violent, uncouth, unrefined, oppressive presidents in dark Africa would not publicly and openly be so inviting of violence. They often pretend that it has nothing to do with them, but Donald Trump is not even pretending. But at the same time, Aisha, I'm envious of the people who've come out into the streets in the United States, black and white, fighting and speaking out and saying enough is enough. We should be seeing that right now here in South Africa. The fact is, this is an indictment on us in South Africa because 11 people in South Africa have died in police custody since these oppressive lockdown rules and regulations were implemented over 2 months ago. 11 people plus one killed by the army that has exonerated itself through its bogus inquiry. And it took the courts in our country to have those military officers suspended. So we are seeing police brutality right now, right here, 11 people. And what did our president say in the last 24 hours? He said that some cops were running ahead of themselves and they let their enthusiasm run ahead of them. I mean, such banal, rhetoric, lack of empathy and gravitas on something so brutal. But it's more an indictment, I think, on South African society because we're not out in the streets. And it's also perhaps a sign of trauma that we've normalized police brutality and the state's control over us, that we think, oh, those people must have been doing something wrong and the police can get away with it. Let me remind you, 11 people died in South Africa since lockdown began in March at the hands of the police or in police custody, and one, that makes it 12, died at the hands of the South African National Defence Force.
But we have seen protests work before in South Africa. So it's not as if you're unaccustomed to seeing how mass action can force change. So why not now?
That's the $1 million question. I think what has happened in South Africa is that there is a lot of complacency, and with COVID-19, there are sections of our society that have deferred their liberties and their freedom to the state, to the government, that the government knows what it is doing. Those people must have broken the law. It's a state of emergency. Well, not officially, but these are just odd times. Everybody's just looking out for themselves and looking out themselves to survive. We probably would have had much more protest were it not for lockdown. I think people are genuinely, Aisha, afraid of COVID-19. We're told to stay away from the streets. Our health systems are weak. Nobody wants to be vulnerable. Certainly the media, NGOs, they're amplifying their voices. They're doing what they can, but it's just not enough. We don't have a history, Aisha, of taking to the streets unless something affects us. It's often the poor who are out in the streets fighting for basic services. But when it comes to civil rights, when it comes to dignity, when it comes to human dignity? Why haven't we marched in our thousands, in our millions, in protest against some of the xenophobic violence that often plagues our nation? It's because perhaps we have become individualistic in the way that we look at things, that if something doesn't affect me, then I'm not going to go out and protest against it. But here's the joke. It does affect us because we're all vulnerable. As soon as the state becomes unaccountable, as soon as it becomes oppressive, as soon as it exercises toxic power, then we are all vulnerable.
Rokhaya, to bring you in there, as we really made the point about having this kind of envy at seeing Americans turn out in the streets these last few days, and it's Black people and it's white people, and they're coming together and they're protesting the events that claimed the life of George Floyd and demanding justice. For you, as you said, and look at things through the lens of France, what is the role of protest when it comes to demanding justice and equality for Black people? I know we've seen the yellow shirts come out to protest, social conditions, economic conditions. But when it comes to this issue of race relations, how ready are the French to come out and protest against that? And how diverse is the coalition calling for that in France?
In France, we have a very different of race relation and racial protests. We are not really accustomed to see an autonomous minority group demanding for racial equality in the French mainland. It happened in the colonies, but not really in the French mainland. So it's very difficult. And the thing is that whenever something happens in the US, the French news are very, very good to cover them and to understand them are the result of a historical process. But the same media are totally unaware to make the same coverage and the same analysis when it comes to France. So what we're hearing now on this French media is that, oh, look at the US, they're doing so bad with minorities, with Black and brown people, but we should not put an equal sign between them and us in France because we don't have the same history. And it's totally, untrue. And that's the reason why there will be a protest tomorrow evening, because there are so many people who died in the hand of the police and there were no consequences. They were not even prosecuted, or they were relaxed when it happened. So Assa Traoré, who is the sister of a young man who died in the hand of the authorities 4 years ago, just decided to start a protest tomorrow in front of the Paris court, just to raise awareness on the fact that it's a global issue. It's not only in the US, but it's, the colonial process, the slavery. It did not only happen in the Americas. It happened all over the world, and it has the same consequences everywhere in the world. So I think that the sad story of George Floyd should give leverage to all the struggles that are going on all around the world, not only in South Africa and in the US, but also in France, in the UK, and in the UK, for example, or even in Germany, because it happens in the same way, but it's not read as something related to our history. And regarding the diversity of the crowd, still in France today, it's very difficult to speak about race because it's seen as something very divisive, because we have this idea of universalism. So whether you're French or you're not French, and once you're French, you shouldn't speak about anything else than being French. So if you speak about race, you are the one being racist. And it's very difficult for minorities just to mention that. It's very difficult, yeah.
Really, what in your view, and given all that what is the role of white people in this battle for social justice and equity for Black people, whether it's in the United States or elsewhere where Black people are minorities and facing discrimination?
I think white people should reckon with history. It is not something that you can avoid just by being decent. I think white people, secondly, must make a carefully considered reflection and distinction between individual actions and institutional culture and systems. What do I mean by that? You often find a white person say, I'm not racist. I want to live alongside Black people. I know a lot of Black people. And in South Africa, we almost make a joke when they say some of my friends are Black. That's you as an individual. But if you have been a beneficiary of systems and institutions that have privileged you based on your identity and left others out, that is the kind of reckoning that we are looking for. It is simple. If you go to a school, a golf club, a social environment where your people, your kind, have the economic power, the power of influence, the power of representation, you ought to say, this is not normal, this is not right. Let's create more spaces at the table. I'll use an example right now, Aisha. I'm watching the news, international networks. I am seeing Black commentators, Black anchors, Black reporters being interviewed by their white counterparts in studio. So the main person in the show is a white person telling the story of race. They may have progressive politics, but representativity is so crucial because we normalize this world where others are left out. Who has authority? Who is the arbiter? Who's legitimate to tell the story? We need to see the world that we aspire towards in our studios, in our shopping centers, in our parks. You shouldn't be comfortable with the fact that your kinds are the only people there. And if they're not the only people there, they're the only people with economic power and with a voice. And I think, thirdly, that white people should really choose their white friends carefully. What do I mean by that? Cringing every time there's racist commentary, there's subliminal racist acts, and saying, I didn't do it. Don't associate with people like that. Call it out. Create opportunities for Black people. Normalize a place of equity and embrace anti-Black racism. Don't cringe and embrace anti-Black. Embrace the fight against anti-racism. And also don't be in denial about being a beneficiary, because only through that heart-to-heart acknowledgement will we turn things around. Acknowledge the privilege.
Rokhaya, do you agree?
I totally agree. Thank you so much for saying that. Many people understand racism as something individual. It's not. It's not a moral matter. Racism is a matter of power and privilege. As long as you understand that, it's not up to someone to say, I'm not racist. The problem is that you live in a system that was designed for you and you still benefit from the oppression of the others. So the question is, how are you willing to engage? And how are you willing to question your own privileges? Because if you have such a good life, it means that you do not really deserve it. You have it because some other are oppressed by that system. So it means that you need to be able to question the comfort you live in. And it's not a comfortable act, like just to understand that you don't deserve everything that you have. And even if you think that you worked out of your own talent, it's not the case. So it means that you don't only need to be an ally, you also need to be a complicit. So because the people of color are the ones who are at risk. So if you are only an ally and you don't take any risk in supporting those people, you're not really useful to the cause. So it means that you need to use your privilege to say, maybe if you are invited to go to a TV show to speak about racism, maybe it's not up to me to speak, and just to give up that position, to give up that space, to allow someone who really need to have that space to speak instead of you. So it's a real process that interrogates everything that you have in your daily life. And it's not only going to the street and say, oh, I'm a good person. It's like questioning your entire life and the life of your family and the legacy, everything that you have, the wealth and all the goods that you have accumulated throughout the history of your family.
Really, when you look at South Africa's success in dismantling the system of apartheid and how they did that, and you look at where the US is now, and this effort to dismantle or to reshape these institutions which exclude Black people, certainly don't treat them fairly. What can American protesters take from the South African struggle?
I think what puts African Americans in the US at a disadvantage is that they are in the minority. So immediately, if this is a numbers game, then those who have the bigger numbers are going to shout the loudest. I think also the weakness of the American struggle is that there has not been enough solidarity built across borders, across the ocean, across continents. And why do I say that? There is a sense in which the United States thinks it is the rest of the world. I don't know how much African Americans have assimilated that. I don't have any expertise in that regard. But we often laugh when we're watching a sports tournament. It's an all-American championship and they call it international. You watch a television network and it calls itself international. And all you see is just America, 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 America. Americans, black and white, need to see themselves as partners in the entire world. We are better able to dismantle oppressive systems when we act in solidarity, in good and in bad times. So the lesson from South Africans didn't dismantle apartheid by themselves. They dismantled apartheid through international and human solidarity, through a connection of like-minded people and not thinking they can do anything they want in the world. Were it not for those international partners, we would not have been able to dismantle apartheid. The second thing is also to learn, though, from us, our mistakes. Populating institutions with black people doesn't make them progressive. It does not transform them. If that were the case, the police in South Africa today would not still be continuing the project of apartheid of killing black people. They are killing black people. They are black. They are killing black people. What does that mean? It means that the face of the institution changed, but the organizational culture that is using oppressive power, that didn't change. Apartheid dependent on abusing state power. And we see black police officers doing the same. So I think that the US needs to be quite nuanced about what it means about transformation, that it's not just numbers, it's not just having African American in spaces, although representation by demographics is important. It is about having transformative conversations, truly identifying what being progressive is all about, and reflecting quite deeply, and we haven't figured this out in South Africa, it's a work in progress, about what kind of country we want to create for our children. I don't think we're doing spectacularly well, and I think we are in denial ourselves about the extent of racism in our society. And you find that there's a huge section of the white population that just doesn't want to hear it. They don't want to talk about racism. You raise racism, they tell you about corruption. Two things can be wrong at the same time. Corruption is a different type of cancer in society, but systemic generational racism and the trauma that it brings to people, that cannot be denied. We need to be open and talk about these conversations and talk about these issues. I beg your pardon.
Rakaya, final word to you. To pick up on something Rudy was just saying there about the need for cross-border coalition or coalition building that African Americans take beyond the borders of the United States, and in the same way that those who were fighting to end apartheid did, decades ago. What's your view on this, or specifically, what's your view on the necessity for African Americans to build stronger alliances with Africans? Let's start there.
I think that thank you for saying that. It's very important to just make sure that people in the US have international awareness. For example, I can take the example of France, and especially Paris, who used to be the refuge of African American in the 20th century. And the narrative about France is still that one, because if you come to France being a Black American, you are very well treated. And you have those African American people perpetuating the narrative of France being so welcoming to Black people. Meanwhile, in the same time, you have local Black people being mistreated. So being aware of what you're used for, to maybe that some narrative that could be used to oppress other people, to me it's very useful. And maybe trying to use international tools like, for example, we are in the middle of the decade of people from African descent that was decided by the UN. And I haven't seen many crossover initiatives going on, leveraged by that international institution. So maybe getting the UN having maybe to send letters to the government, just mentioning all the similar issues that are going on in the US, in Brazil, in South Africa, in Europe. Maybe that could help people understanding that it's not only one case in Minneapolis, but many cases happening in many different places. And to me, it's not only the African Americans. I think that many other people in other countries feel very isolated, and we don't really use all the tools that we should be able to use to pressure our governments, because at the end of the day, the naming and shaming plays well on government, and no government wants to be speaking bad about from the outside. So it's something that could be very, very helpful, according to me.
Such a great conversation, so much to think about in the hours ahead. Really, Kalbi Rokhaya Diallo, thank you so much for speaking so candidly and so insightfully about where we find ourselves, and to look beyond the borders of the United States and see the linkages with other places in the world. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Take care, ladies. I hope you took lots away from that. They are phenomenal journalists, and you should check out their work online. They speak truthfully and forcefully about these issues in their respective countries, and they provide great insight. I think that there's lots to pick out from that conversation, but I think specifically the need to build alliances, beyond the United States, and for white people to be aware of their privileges and to come to terms with the discomfort, if you feel it, when these conversations around racism occur. Get over it, but use your privilege for good. Use your privilege to help change the system, to make it fair and equal for all. I think that's definitely what we need. All right, we are keeping track of 5 major stories for you in the hours ahead. Let me bring those to you. We're looking at DRC and new Ebola cases there. The country has been battling Ebola now for a number of years, on and off. It seems to always be lurking in the background. And new cases have emerged in the western city of Mbandanka. According to the country's health minister, 4 people recently died there, and they have added to the toll of more than 2,000 people who died from Ebola since this outbreak began in 2018. All of this comes amidst coronavirus, which of course continues to cast a long shadow over the country. The government is battling more than 3,000 cases of COVID-19. Looking at Kenya, and they're beginning to lift the lockdown. That's despite the steady rise in cases. Kenya's President Uhuru Kenyatta says that he's eyeing an easing of restrictions there and has notified the relevant ministries to start that work. Some people were wondering about the wisdom of all of this, given the fact that Kenya continues to see cases each and every day. But the president says there'll be more guidelines in the coming day. Kenya, amongst one of the most impacted countries in Eastern Africa, with 2,021 cases. Also looking at Ghana, where their gradual reopening continues. President Nana Akufo-Addo addressed the nation on Sunday. That was his 10th address. He says that they're going to continue this gradual conditional lifting of restrictions with added disease control measures put in place to make sure it doesn't erode whatever progress that has been made. Schools are reopening in mid-June. Some places of worship, I think all places of worship actually have been given the go-ahead to open with infection control measures, and social gathering will be allowed under certain conditions. Uganda is also a place that we're keeping an eye on, as we heard of 2 MPs there being arrested after they staged a protest calling for the closure of Uganda's border with South Sudan in an effort to curb the spread of coronavirus in that country. A police spokesman is quoted in local media saying the 2 politicians were arrested because they didn't have a permit for the protest. This issue of infected lorry drivers is one that we continue to watch on the continent. We've heard it out of Uganda and Zambia, and concerns in Kenya and Tanzania. In the case of Uganda, the health minister said about 50 truck drivers who arrived from South Sudan over the weekend all tested positive for COVID-19. Uganda currently has 458 confirmed cases, no deaths reported. And finally, back to South Africa. They're moving to level 3 of lockdown easing, so they're opening up the country. Schools are now scheduled to open on June 8th. They had been due to open this week, in fact today, but after consultations between the Education Ministry and teachers, they decided to delay it by a week so that schools could make more preparations. However, it must be said that parents in South Africa have taken to Twitter to express their concerns that they are moving ahead with schools opening, given the fact that the country has more than 32,000 cases of coronavirus and 683 cases. We're going to continue to follow those stories for you in the hours ahead. All right, viewers' comments. Now you have been watching and sending in lots of messages. Auntie Sowabasi says, thank you very much. Very informative with regards to the conversation with Rukaya and Reedy. Thank you for that. Lots of people expressing real pleasure at that conversation. Rosamund Conte adding her words there. Julia Kita says, thank you for your knowledge and voice. Sia Boss says, in response to Marietta Patricia Taylor Kamara, Black leaders need to speak up. It starts in Africa and we need to rise finally. Lots of people just, again, shaken by what's playing out in the United States. Emanuela Indifoa says, man's inhumanity to man. It's shocking. It was truly shocking to see those pictures and indeed the inhumanity. This one from Zaina Bangura, solidarity all over. She says exactly, solidarity all over. Claude Granitsky says it's always a numbers game, which references a comment made by Reedy there that when it comes to this battle, and in this battle to right the wrong, to level the unequal playing field in the US and for Black people to rightfully be acknowledged and respected and given their full rights, really makes the point that dismantling the system is hard because of the numbers, that Black people are the minority, and Claude agrees. He says it's always a numbers game. John Mdaka says racists must be called out and actions taken against them. Marietta Patricia Taylor Kamara, who's commented many times throughout the show, and thank you for that, says we need to wake up. Black people and leaders need waking up. Thank you to everyone who has written in throughout today's show. It is greatly appreciated. Thank you for making your voices heard. We're coming to the end of the show, and normally at this stage, this is when we look at the bright side and leave you with something to make you laugh, something to take your mind off the issues at hand. But today we're going to keep the focus on the racial injustice and the struggle of Black people here in this country, in the hope that through this conversation we can chart a path towards finding hope and arriving at a place of healing. My guest for today's conversation, today's bright side conversation, because we are still in search of the bright side, is a top US journalist. He is known for being outspoken and for not holding back. I'm talking about the one and only Roland Martin. Take a look.
Hey fam, lots of drama in America. I'll be joining Isha Sesay on her Instagram Live at 4:30 today Eastern, 4:30 p.m. Eastern, talking about issues of the day. Of course, I Can't Breathe, killing of Black men, George Floyd, a number of other issues. So be sure to check us out again. Instagram Live today at 4:30 p.m. Eastern. All right, peace.
It's a conversation you won't want to miss with the one and only Roland Martin. You know that he's going to be, as the cool kids would say, dropping facts over on Instagram, joining him in 3 minutes. I hope you can cross over and be part of that conversation and make your voice heard. But for today's show, right here, right now, we've come to the end. Thank you if you're watching on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. Thank you for taking this time out. In fact, it was longer than an hour, or about an hour and a half. Thank you for giving up so much of your day to be part of this conversation. It is always appreciated. I hope you'll join me here tomorrow, same time, same place. But if you want to keep talking, join Roland and myself over on Instagram Live in 2 minutes. Thank you for all your time, as always. We're going to head over to Instagram. That's it for today's show. Please stay safe, everyone, and let's keep talking. Bye for now.